To corporate governance lecture. Let's start with a definition of corporate governance. Um, our focus for corporate governance is in finance. Therefore, the definition is a financial definition. It says corporate governance is a set of financial incentives. Um, we provide people with money um, um, and safeguards, dispute resolutions, and these monies, such as wages and dispute resolution methodologies, are used to control and coordinate actions of various stakeholders. Let's pause on this word stakeholder a bit. This could be shareholders, suppliers, customers, workers, everyone who has a stake in the corporation, government, the environment that is getting affected by pollution that the corporation causes. The idea is to bring these stakeholders to the center of contracts or nexus of contracts and use these incentives um, to get them to do the right thing, to produce. For example, we need to produce jet airplanes, and the task is complex. So we need workers, engineers, patents, um, government permissions. And all of these various stakeholders need to cooperate with us. So we do this um, complex task of making jet airplanes. When these stakeholders come together, of course, they have conflict of interest. For example, the workers don't want to work as hard as the contract requires. They have a family, they enjoy their spare time. And these conflicts of interest are inherent in the corporate form, um, and part of this corporate governance is dealing with conflicts of interest. And the ultimate objective is to generate wealth. This wealth is in terms of assets that the corporation uses efficiently and produces wealth for shareholders, of course, subject to a constraint that other stakeholders receive a fair share, um, a share that is contractually promised to them under uncertainty um, and with the sharing rule. If you look at this definition carefully, you see a certain number of ideas are presented in color. Incentives are important in corporate governance. Um, Often money, a share of the future output. Um, then conflict of interest is important. Assets that the corporation holds is important. Efficiency in managing the corporation, and of course, maximizing the wealth that belongs to the owners of the firm. For a public corporation, that's the shareholders. And if we look at the role of finance in corporate governance, again, this word nexus of financial contracts is important. We are viewing the corporation as a place that we keep all these contracts, and these contracts are sharing rules that are of a financial nature. They provide a share of the expected future output, which is uncertain, and this share is often measured in monetary terms. And of course, another item in red is the cost of this conflict of interest. The stakeholders um, uh, have an agency problem, a conflict of interest, and that leads to a second best contract. And therefore, this conflict of interest is costly. And of course, there is asymmetric information. So one party cannot see all the information that the other party knows. Without asymmetric information, agency problems are automatically resolved by a forcing contract, and we observe the manager, and if he or she doesn't do the right thing, then the payoff would not be there. But when there is asymmetric information, we can't observe everything that the manager does as, let's say, a small stakeholder or shareholder. And the other fact is, the other ingredient that we need so agency problems exist is risk and uncertainty. If we were in a world of certainty, with hard work, there would be a huge output. Let's say if you're farming with hard labor, we would have a huge harvest. But in world of uncertainty, there might be not enough rain, and the conditions of environment may change such that even though we work very hard, we have no harvest, a drought. Um, so in a world of risk and uncertainty, we can't tell the manager that we give you a share of output. If you work hard, this share would be larger. Um, then we don't know if uh, we have no output because the manager didn't work hard, or because there was um, um, a risky event outside of her control that caused this uh, output to not be there, a drought or situation like that. Now let us focus on the objectives of corporate governance. Ideally, corporate governance would like to eliminate conflict of interest. However, under asymmetric information, with lack of observability in a risky world, elimination of conflict of interest may not be possible. Therefore, we want to find methods that reduce conflict of interest. How can we get the managers to feel and act like owners? For example, we can give them um, call options for a public firm. So if they work hard, the value of these options will go up when the value of the firm goes up and the shareholders uh, get more wealth. Another objective of corporate governance is to make sure that assets are used efficient, efficiently and to the best interest of shareholders, not for enjoyment of managers or workers, but for maximizing shareholder wealth, which is an objective of finance, with the assumption that stakeholders could impose constraints that ensures a share uh, of the wealth that is generated for every stakeholder, a fair share. And obviously, if that condition is not there, this assumption of shareholder wealth maximization amounts to um, expropriating wealth, taking wealth away from workers and other stakeholders. Good corporate governance should also define shareholder rights, so small shareholders are not taken advantage of. It should define oversight and monitoring responsibility. Who would monitor and ensure that various stakeholders do the right thing? It should provide transparency and accuracy in disclosures, so information asymmetry is reduced. The information that outsiders don't see but insiders have, to a large extent, can be shared, as long as corporate governance provides for more transparency and accuracy. For example, good annual accounting statements um, would provide a good picture of firms' finances and provide for more transparency. A couple of cautionary notes that we should keep in mind is Having a fair, professional, ethical, and legal treatment of shareholders is not one of the core attributes um, of corporate governance, but it's something that board of directors should have in mind. In fact, under the American free enterprise system, free market system, the board is primarily responsible to shareholders. Um, the other issue is that conflict of interest between bondholders and the stockholders. That is, the stockholders or owners may want to shoulder more risk and take advantage of bondholders who have loaned money with with the understanding that there is a certain limited amount of risk. So if the risk is increased, uh, owners may benefit from a higher payoff, but higher riskier payoff. But debt holders only receive a fixed interest, no matter how high this risky payoff is. So the conflict of interest between bondholders and stockholders is mostly about risk. Uh, Stockholders would like a more risk as long as it's prudent, but bondholders would like as little risk as possible. This conflict of interest is not really at the heart of corporate governance. However, a good corporate governance system may also create value for shareholders by not taking advantage of debt holders. After all, FOMO has this discussion in his theoretical um, financial insights on this topic that before we get a loan, usually the market puts the um, whatever they can't observe, they assume the worst and they put it on our shoulder, on the manager's shoulders. So if shareholders could somehow resolve this conflict of interest, they would see a smaller cost of debt capital, and that way they can create value for stockholders. Let's continue with this conflict of interest and look at it in more detail um, as we look at different forms of organizing a business. One form of organizing a business is a sole proprietorship. In a sole proprietorship, an individual owner owns the firm and provides capital to it and runs it, controls it. In other words, the key concept here is that there is no separation between control and ownership. Control and ownership is in hands of one individual. In that case, there is no conflict of interest between managers and owners. They are one individual. And if that individual takes advantage of the firm, for example, the individual purchases a jet airplane for the business and uses it for personal benefit. Since the business completely belongs to this individual, the individual owner is consuming from his or her assets. Therefore, there isn't a conflict of interest. He or she is not taking advantage of the owner's wealth, but consumes from his own assets or her own assets. However, another type of conflict of interest still remains, and that's conflict of interest between suppliers and owner and between creditors and owners. The owner may take more risk and pretend to the bank or that this company has less risk. And of course, One may take advantage of suppliers by paying late or increasing the risk so that bankruptcy becomes more likely and expected payoff to suppliers becomes smaller than they have assumed using the credit that they provide. Next form of business is partnerships. There are one or more partners, usually two or more partners would be correct. And because if it's one, it would be sole proprietorship. And these partners are owners and they manage the firm. Typically, law firms, some accounting firms are run this way. Again, the conflict of interest is very much similar to sole proprietorships. Owners don't have a separation of control. They control and run the business. Therefore, there is no conflict of interest between managers and the stockholders or owners. But the other conflict of interest with creditors and suppliers remains in place. This separation of ownership and control is quite important. It happens in a public corporation because owners or stockholders have dispersed ownership, small shares of stocks, and they don't run the corporation. They hire professional managers who run the corporation but are not owners. And so people who run the corporation can take advantage of owners and this becomes a conflict of interest, which we study in finance. Corporations are often the focus of our study in finance because public corporations are large and generate quite a bit of output, and they are important to uh, our economy. Um, a corporation itself is a distinct legal entity, can act like a legal individual. And once we have this corporation in place, we have that separation of ownership and control that I talked about before. The owners are stockholders, they have few shares, and the professional managers, chief executive officer, financial officer, marketing manager, they run the corporation. These professional managers could take advantage of the owners. For example, the chief executive officer could purchase a jet airplane instead of flying with public airlines. Jet airplanes are expensive to maintain and expensive to run, uh, but hey, the owners pay for it. The chief executive officer doesn't pay for it from one's pocket. Um, and of course, if this was a sole proprietorship, um, purchasing of this jet airplane may not be to the best advantage of the owners and may not maximize the wealth of the owners. Um, of course, there are some exceptional cases where it's needed and maximizes the wealth of owners, but when it's not, then it would not be taken. Or if a sole proprietorship um, takes this, he or she buys a jet airplane, he or she is consuming from the wealth that belongs to that individual. And so again, there is no wealth appropriation from someone else. So at the heart of this conflict of interest is someone, like the manager who controls the firm, taking wealth away from someone who is the owner of the firm. And of course, this separation of ownership means the stockholders don't have a huge say on how to run the corporation. Yeah, the large shareholders, those who have a block, let's say 5% or 20%, certainly can pick up the phone and discuss with managers what should be done, and they would have their discussion would have a weight. But if you and I purchase one share, let's say in Siemens or IBM, and pick up the phone and want to talk to the board or to the chief executive officer and tell them what to do, and they probably won't take that phone call. One shareholder who puts down, let's say, $100 is too small to influence the corporate decision making. So we talk about a conflict of interest between managers and shareholders. A relatively newer conflict of interest that you might have not heard as much about is a conflict of interest between shareholders and the board of directors. Legally, the board of directors should represent the shareholders, should uh, look after the best interest of shareholders. But manager often chooses the board members. Um, and membership in a board usually has a good compensation and fewer working hours. So quite a few um, individuals who are qualified to do this job would be very happy to take this job. Therefore, the management who appoints this selection committee that chooses the board members has quite a bit of influence. If there is a board member that does not go along with what manager wants, that board member may not be appointed to the board again or to other boards. So there is some um, influence that management has on selection of board members and their behavior. And this influence gives um, rise to this conflict of interest where the board members may not do everything to the best interest of shareholders, particularly when it comes to the compensation for the managers. Many of these board members may be chief executive officers of other firms uh, and similar firms. Therefore, if there is a pay raise for the chief executive officer and they vote for it, this may affect their own pay. Therefore, there are quite a few incentives there that makes the board aligned with the management. Agency theory is a technical area which have won a number of economists the Nobel Prize. There are certain terminologies from this technical area that we should know. One is the word principal versus agent. You probably know these terms from World of Sports. Um, a football player gets an agent. That helps us understand the meaning of these words in agency theory. Principal is the owner, the one who hires the agent. So the owners are stockholders, shareholders, and they hire a professional manager, such as the chief executive officer, to run a corporation, to control the corporation, because this corporation is huge and the task requires certain skills that shareholders necessarily don't have, and also because there are many shareholders and dispersed ownership would make it difficult for each one of them to exert control. Uh, the agent exerts control on behalf of the principal. Then we get to this principal agent problem. Well, the agent has his or her best interest in mind. And the agent maximizes um, um, his own utility or wealth. Um, in simpler words, words put in red in this slide, we say agents act for their own benefit, and not necessarily for the best interest of the principal. And of course, this gives rise to conflicts of interest between managers as agents and shareholders as principals, board of directors as agents, and shareholders as principal. Here are some examples that are common in CFA exams. 1. The agent wisely, um, make that unwisely, expands the size of the firm. If you are managing a company and managing 1,000 people, that would lead to higher salary, and it would also enhance your labor capital than managing only 8 people. So size of the corporation may become bloated uh, just because managers prefer this, even though a smaller lean and mean size is better for the owners. The next area of conflict um, is compensation. Naturally, the agent prefers more compensation, more money to less money. And compensation, one component of it is salaries, wages, and of course bonuses. Another component is what we call perk consumption. And perk consumption can be explained much better with examples. For example, having three different secretaries when one is quite enough, but the manager feels more prestigious. Having offices in a very ritzy area of New York or Munich, when in a small village where the corporate headquarters are, um, um, rent is much cheaper and offices can be there, but it's not prestigious enough and doesn't afford the lifestyle that the chief executive officer may be seeking. But this may not be to the advantage of the shareholders. Shareholders may prefer that the manager lives in this small corporate village and runs the corporation there. It's more efficient. Risk could also be a problem, uh, and this is a two-edged sword. Sometimes managers take too much risk, and this way they take wealth from the owners. Um, if the manager takes a huge gamble, and if the gamble pays off, the manager wins in terms of having the potential of moving to better jobs and getting more payoff. And if the risk doesn't pay off, only the shareholders lose their money. Mm, Obviously, these are exaggerated cases um, because, of course, in bankruptcy, manager loses too. But there are situations where um, owners have a lot more to lose than the manager if the risk doesn't pay off. So the manager may take that high risk venture, which doesn't provide as much compensation in line with its risk for the owners. The opposite also holds. There are situations where managers prefer to have a protected, comfortable job rather than take prudent risk that generates more wealth but keeps the manager out of his or her comfort zone and makes their life more difficult. Um, so they may, out of personal interest, not take that risk. Let's now focus on the directors versus the shareholders. There are a number of problems that are well understood and has to do with directors. The first item is lack of independence. Essentially, this says that directors are dependent on managers and they serve with the best interest of managers in mind, and this could not be necessarily the best interest of the shareholders or owners. After all, the board members are supposed to legally represent the shareholders. When they don't, and they are not independent of managers, um, there would be an agency problem. Board members may also have personal relationships with managers, be family members or friends of the manager. So, beside financial relationships, there might also be personal relationships that causes a conflict of interest, essentially causes the board member to side with manager and not do the best for the shareholders. Board members might be tied to the managers with lucrative consulting agreements that paid some side benefits. Therefore, they don't want to lose these consulting agreements and they do what managers ask. And again, there will be a conflict of interest between shareholders and board members. There might be interlocking or interlinking boards. That is where some board members of firm A are managers of the firm B, and then several managers of firm B are on the board A. Um, and therefore, this more complicated relationship makes the board members and the managers to be tied to each other, and at the very least be in a position where if they don't do the best for managers, if the board doesn't do the best for manager in one firm, in firm A, then the relationship in firm B might be such that there are reprisals and uh, this particular individual is disciplined. And fear of that reprisal may make the board members um, to act not in the best interest of shareholders, but put up with what managers ask, even though these managers are not asking for something that is to the best interest of shareholders. And of course, compensation of directors is a problem too. They might be overpaid, and um, this being overpaid ties them very much to the manager because if they don't act to the best interest of the manager could replace them and they would lose this high paying job that otherwise they can't get given their skill sets. Um, so the whole point of this agency problem is that board members may be aligned with managers and not with shareholders. And quite a few items mentioned in this list are commonplace with board members in corporate board, uh, in real board. Let us now focus on the responsibilities of the board of directors, and if as a financial analyst we are asked to look at the core competencies and qualification of members of the board, what would we be looking at? One of the responsibilities of board of directors is to institute corporate values. Example of corporate values are items like dependability. For example, we are producing products that would be uh, dependable. Um, Consistency, we have a corporation that consistently delivers what we promise. Efficiency, uh, we make the product uh, more efficiently than others, for example, in terms of cost. Each one of these can be a corporate value that the board members set. Board members are also responsible for creating long-term strategic objectives. An example of a long-term strategic objective is to cut the cost by 5% per year for the next 4 years, or to grow the sales by 2% per year. This is a goal and it's a strategic, and the board of directors uh, could set it for a firm and then together with managers, find ways of achieving these goals. And of course, goals should be objectively achievable. They should not be pie in the sky. Determine managers' responsibilities. Of course, board often has um, this ability to hire and fire the chief executive officers, and thereby affects the other members of the management team. Additional responsibilities of board of directors is to push for availability of complete and accurate information, ensure that this information is shared within the corporation, to meet regularly, and to, uh, of course, put processes in place so that board members are adequately trained. As a CFA or a financial analyst, we might be asked to evaluate whether a corporation has a good corporate governance in terms of board of directors that it has. There are a few criteria we can use. Uh, Number one, um, 75% of directors are at least independent. By an independent director, we mean that this director did not work all his or her career in the corporation and then became a director. But this director is an outsider, a marketing manager from another firm, a finance professional um, from outside, a professor, an engineer, a scientist. Those are independent directors. We also look at the board chairman, and this is the person who brings the agenda in front of the board, and we want this person to also be independent from corporation, um, you know, not to be an employee, long-term employee of that corporation. A common way that independence of board chairman is violated is when the same person is the chief executive officer and is also the chairman of the board. Um, Imagine that the decision is to remove the chief executive officer. Well, chief executive officer would not ever put this decision in front of the board to remove herself or himself. So this gives you an idea of the importance of that independence. It's important for discipline and for running the board effectively. Board members should have qualifications as directors. For example, someone who is um, having an engineering background for an engineering firm, or a marketing background um, as a needed skill on the board. Um, Not someone who is the brother-in-law of the chief executive officer, with that being the only qualification that the individual has, or someone who is politically connected to a famous politician, and that being the only qualification that the board member has. So these are some things that an analyst can look at. Um, One can also look at election procedures, and one factor is how often elections are taking place. Um, Election once a year for board members is preferred. Once every other year is the second best. Does the board have a method to assess its own practices and weaknesses and strengths of what it already have done? Um, are there separate sessions, and how often these separate sessions are held where only independent board members meet and they're not influenced by uh, uh, board members that are dependent on the firm? For example, at least once a year, the independent board members should meet. The audit committee is important, and does it have independent directors in it that they can look at the procedures of the board and audit it, or look at the actions of managers and audit it. Nominating committee is a committee that chooses the board members, and the best practice is to have independent directors in that committee rather than uh, a common practice with many corporations that have insiders that are closely related to the chief executive officer in the nominating committee. Compensation committee decides the pay for top managers, especially chief executive officers, and it's important to see if this compensation committee has procedures to tie performance to pay, and not give raises when the corporation is underperforming. And of course, use of independent and legal counsel is important for a board. To continue the best practices, um, a financial analyst could look at a statement of governance policies. This statement sets out how board of directors, chief executive officer, and shareholders run the corporation and interact with each other, and together do this act of running the corporation. Um, these governance policies could have items um, um, such as making sure that individuals are accountable, that the board is run and the corporation is run in a way that consensus can be reached, that different individuals can participate and express their views and their knowledge, and that the process is transparent, responsive, and of course, these are examples of items that can go to the statement of governance policies and make it a good one. Um, that governance is effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and of course follows the rules of law. Disclosure and transparency are also important things to look at if one evaluates the board of directors. The more disclosure, the more transparency, the more light that is put on actions of the board, and the more coverage of their actions, which is allowed, is better. Um, Another area is insider or related party transactions. For example, if the marketing manager um, purchases a machinery, a used machine that the corporation owns, these sort of transactions lend themselves to conflict of interest. Therefore, it is important if board approval for related party transactions is required. Um, um, Finally, responsiveness to shareholder proxy votes. When there is a proxy fight, uh, for example, the manager is pushed uh, via a proxy to separate two businesses, separate the cigarette business from the food business. And manager may not want to have a smaller firm, but the owners may feel that this is value increasing and they may want to vote on it. The board should be open to uh, conducting a proxy vote, and seeing that there is a fair proxy fight. The corporate governance policies that we talked about before has attributes that a financial analyst could look at and analyze and figure out if the governance policy is a good governance policy. First is codes of ethics. Second is Directors' oversight and monitoring. Third is management's responsibility to the board. Fourth is reports of directors' oversight. Um, the fifth one is board self-assessments. Sixth one is management performance assessment. And finally, what kind of training the directors receive. Corporate governance affects value of a company. It leads to good corporate governance leads to higher profitability, to higher returns for investors. Weak and ineffective corporate governance increases the riskiness of the corporation for the investors, reduces the value of the firm, and of course, in extreme cases, leads to bankruptcy.